This is the Confederation Report, one of the flagship podcasts of the Cántaro Institute. My name is Stephen Martins, and I'll be your host, bringing you incisive analysis, cultural commentary, and thought-provoking interviews on the issues shaping Canadian life and beyond, all through the lens of a biblical worldview. Because Christ is Lord, over Canada, over culture, over all of life. Thank you for joining us for a special episode of the Confederation Report. With the recent acquisition of our 170-acre property, Worldview Campus in Wellandport, and preparing the property for ministry use, we've shifted from a weekly to a monthly release schedule. And at times, we will have bi-weekly releases, and on this occasion, we have occasion for one. And that occasion is Bill C-9. Let me provide a bit of an overview of what Bill C-9 is for those outside of Canada who happen to be, well, not in the know. Bill C-9 is a proposed law that, while aiming to address matters relating to violence and intimidation, happens to go too far in expanding the criminal code in ways that could threaten fundamental freedoms. It creates new crimes related to blocking access to certain places, increases penalties for so-called hate-motivated offenses, and restricts the public display of certain symbols. However, the bill's definitions, especially around hatred, are broad, they're subjective, which raises concerns that peaceful protest, religious teaching, or moral disagreement could be misinterpreted as criminal. In short, Bill C-9 risks giving the state excessive power to regulate expression and religious activity in ways that could undermine a free and democratic society. Here today with me is Paul Lawton of ARPA Canada, the Association for Reform Political Action. Paul, thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks, Pastor Stephen.
Paul, I want to ask you just a very brief question before we get into depth here. Can you explain a little bit more about what ARPA is and the work they do?
Sure. So ARPA Canada exists to educate, equip, and encourage Reformed Christians for political action and to bring a biblical perspective to our civil authorities. So at a deeper level, well, we're trying to help Christians think clearly about the role that God has given to the civil government. As the Belgian Confession puts it, God has ordained civil authorities to promote good order and to restrain evil. And at the same time, of course, well, the state is not the church, and it doesn't have authority over doctrine or conscience. So ARPA's work is about helping Christians engage that sphere faithfully, seeking justice, promoting what is good, and calling our authorities to act within the limits that God has set for them. So practically, that includes grassroots engagement through local chapters that we have across the country, policy and advocacy work, meeting with elected officials, and speaking into legislation like Bill C-9, and legal interventions in key court cases, and ongoing education to help Christians think and act wisely in public life. So it's really about bringing principle and practice together.
Before we tackle Bill C-9 directly, I want to just kind of touch very broadly as to what is problematic just in general about the term hate speech, because a lot of people have thrown that term around, and it's also become very commonplace. Is it a term that we can use? Is it a term that is quite, one might say politically charged, but I think it's more so than just politics, but it's rooted in a particular worldview, and maybe you can explain a little bit more about that.
No, that's right. That's helpful. And the difficulty really with the category of hate speech is that it blurs a distinction between actual wrongdoing and expression of belief. So as I mentioned earlier, the civil magistrate, of course, is called to punish evil and protect what is good. But when the law begins to regulate speech based on whether it's perceived as harmful or offensive, well, then the state has moved into the realm of judging truth claims and no longer adjudicating, based on actual action. And so once that happens, that standard is no longer clearly grounded, and it tends to reflect the moral assumptions of the culture when the state gets into judging motive and thought. And so that creates a situation that we've seen already in Canada where speaking truthfully, especially on contested moral issues, we think of sexuality, gender, human identity, just expressing convictions can be treated as if it's wrongdoing.
Would you say that it's fair to say that the real issue, particularly with Bill C-9, is the loss of protection for people speaking from religious conviction?
Sure, that's the central issue. As you helpfully outlined in your introduction there, there's more to the bill than just the so-called good faith religious defense, but really that is the key issue. So the bill as it stands now removes an explicit protection that recognized that speaking from scripture or teaching Christian doctrine is not the same thing as promoting hatred. So for Christians, of course, well, that matters because our faith is not merely private. We are called to confess the truth publicly. And when that protection is removed, the law becomes less clear in how it treats that kind of speech.
Yeah. So, from a legal judicial perspective, or within that sort of realm, what exactly did the good faith religious defense protect, and what changes once it's gone or it's removed?
Sure. So the good faith religious defense protected sincere expression on religious subjects. So quoting scripture, teaching doctrine, articulating moral convictions rooted in faith. It didn't protect extreme or abusive speech. It operated within a fairly high legal threshold where hatred is defined as extreme detestation or vilification. So, what it did was recognize that when someone speaks sincerely without intent to stir up hatred or violence, they're engaged in something fundamentally different from hate propaganda. So, once that defense is removed, that recognition is no longer explicitly grounded in the law and creates all kinds of uncertainty.
So, all right. So, in light of this, do you think that realistically this could lead to Christians being investigated or charged just for explaining biblical teaching on moral issues, whether that's in a church setting, or in a public setting, in a group setting?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that Christians will immediately be prosecuted simply for explaining biblical teaching. The criminal law still has a fairly high threshold, even if it's lowered. But removing a clear safeguard makes the boundaries less certain. And when that happens, it also sends a message to police, to prosecutors about how these kinds of cases are to be approached. So if the law no longer clearly the good faith distinguishes good faith religious expression from hate propaganda, that can influence how complaints are received, how investigations are handled, and which cases are pursued. So the concern is not immediate, widespread prosecution, but a gradual erosion of clarity that has helped protect ordinary Christian speech and a shift in how the law is applied in practice.
All right. So, then how do we distinguish legally between hate speech and sincerely held religious beliefs, especially once that defense is removed? What's sort of kind of the go-to if you were in a court setting, you had to defend someone?
Yeah, so legally, the distinction is supposed to rest on intent and the nature of the expression. So the courts have said that hatred involves extreme detestation or vilification, not mere disagreement. But in practice, those distinctions depend on how the law is applied. And so when those explicit protections are removed, it becomes more difficult to maintain that distinction consistently. So that's why the defense mattered. It helped ensure that sincere confession of the truth was not treated as wrongdoing.
Okay. Now, where exactly is Bill C-9 right now in the courts? I think it's gone through a couple of readings, but where exactly is it?
Yeah, so as of right now, Monday at noon, it's scheduled today. It's scheduled today to come up in the House of Commons, but not at the report stage, I believe, but not yet to a third reading. So,
Okay.
as best we can tell, a third reading and a final vote could be as early as Monday evening. It
Oh,
could be later this week. That's
okay.
kind of our best guess based on the parliamentary schedule.
Okay. Now, so that there is a bit of time there, and I'll get to a question soon regarding what we can be doing as Christians in light of this, and in terms of expressing our own concerns as faithful Canadian citizens. But first, I just want to talk a little bit about the guys Christian daily life, about the church. Do you think that as a result of this bill actually coming into law, that we're going to start to see Christians starting to self-censor? Maybe they don't write about certain things, maybe they'll comment about certain things, maybe they're a little bit more careful on social media, they're a little bit more careful what they say at work. Do you think that's something that could end up happening as a result of this?
Yeah, and you would have a perspective on this too, of course, as a pastor, Stephen. I think that's a really I think it's a very real concern. When the law becomes less clear, people tend to become more cautious. It does, and it can and it does lead to self-censorship, not because something is necessarily explicitly forbidden, but because it might be. And over time, that can reshape how people speak in the public square, even without direct enforcement. So we all, Stephen, I'll speak for myself, but I think broadly, Christians are tempted to a fear of man. That's a temptation we face, and so the for Christians, it's not it shouldn't be an option for us to do that, right? It's a temptation. But even, from my own confessional tradition in the Heidelberg Catechism, our duties under the ninth commandment are clear that we're to love the truth, speak it candidly, and openly acknowledge it. So when we withhold the truth, when we call what is evil good, when we affirm what God forbids, or even if we just keep silent out of fear or out of uncertainty, we're not just avoiding risk, we're failing in our duty before God, and in our responsibility to love our neighbor by confronting them with the truth.
Oh, you're absolutely right about that. And having experienced this as well firsthand as a pastor, there are terms that are just kind of just expressions. It's they're biblical expressions, or simply just expressing what Scripture teaches on certain issues such as marriage, gender, and so forth. That people, they're not as open as, particularly Christians, they're not as open as discussing these terms publicly. They're more comfortable speaking about it in church settings because they're alongside like-minded people. But when they're in the world, they're a lot more careful in terms of what they say. Will I get in trouble? Am I assuming someone's pronouns? And because we operate from a biblical worldview, and it was at one point it was, well, okay, we agree to disagree. You have your worldview, I have mine, and I'm going to operate and live according to my worldview. And so whatever I say, if it offends you, it wasn't my intention to offend you, but it's the truth. Now it's more so, well, now I don't just have to deal with the fact that you might be personally offended, and that's not my fault because I was just speaking the truth and trying to speak it candidly and lovingly. It's the fact that now there's a potential punitive measure that will follow as retribution, as a consequence of what I've said, because there are these new culturally defined norms that the government is trying to put in place and cement for the future and for future generations. And in order to do that, there has to be punitive measures involved in order for the people to kind of go along with it, so to speak. And so we've already began to see the fear of man in a lot of people and being just kind of shy. Should I tell even people that I'm a Christian, even because they're going to start assuming things. And maybe I should just, not say anything in relation to what my religious affiliation is, whatever happens to be my religious worldview and so forth. But now I think it's a lot more. It's a lot more serious. It's a lot more closer to home, I would say, because you know that it's not just a matter of, oh, this person's upset. It's more, oh, well, the government might actually come down on me for having said something that is scripturally true and accurate. And it was just, meant in a totally innocent way. Um, from a Kuyperian worldview, in which we understand, of course, that to mean understanding the sphere sovereignty of Abraham Kuyper, how he's put that forward in his tradition. Would this be an example of the state stepping outside of its sphere and stepping into another sphere that it doesn't belong to, namely regulating belief and confession?
Yeah, I think that's a helpful way to raise the issue, and I think I would frame it more directly in terms of the limits that God has placed on civil authority, right? So, I referred already to the Heidelberg Catechism. The Belgian Confession has um, clear delineation in terms of the role of the state and of the church, and the Westminster Confession likewise teaches the civil magistrate has authority to maintain justice and peace, but not to govern the ministry of the word or matters of faith. And so when the state begins regulating speech based on whether it aligns with certain moral or ideological standards, well, it moves beyond restraining evil and into judging belief and judging confession. And that's clearly, obviously outside of the authority that God has given to it.
Now, Bill, as you mentioned, Bill C-9 isn't law just yet. It faces as one last reading, another vote in the House of Commons. Uh, you've done something, and by you, I mean also you and ARPA Canada. You've done something by mobilizing Christian citizens who have expressed their concerns to Ottawa. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Sure. Yeah. And so we, ARPA Canada, it was a full organization effort. We organized a rally on Parliament Hill. So that was on March 12th. We had hundreds of supporters there from across Ontario, a couple from Quebec as well, actually. So we one of our chapters graciously offered to pay to charter a bus to go from Southern Ontario to Ottawa. We ended up having to have 4 buses in the end to accommodate the number of supporters that came kind of from all across Southern Ontario to Ottawa. So it was a great time of public witness. So we had Rod Taylor, leader of the Christian Heritage Party, spoke. 2 MPs, Andrew Lawton and Jacob Mantle, both spoke. There were 13 MPs there who wanted to be photographed there with our supporters, with our signs that stood behind the MPs as they spoke. It was a great. We also actually had a pastor from Wellandport, Reverend Joel Dykstra, as well. So it was a great time of public witness, calling on our elected officials to do what's right and to show that that there's great opposition to this bill. In terms of what can still be done, I know you mentioned that the website. So in addition to all the resources on the ARPA website, there's a simple site, stopc9.ca. stopc9.ca. And really one of the most helpful things you can do right now is to go there and click on call list. So you can get a kind of organized list of MPs to call. So there have already been more than 113,000 phone calls made to MPs on Bill C-9, which is encouraging. But as of now, anyway, there's still time for people to speak up. So that kind of engagement, respectful, polite, but firm phone call, especially prefaced by, with words like, I want to let you know that your answer to the following question is going to be determinative of how I vote in the next election, and then ask them where they stand on Bill C-9, or simply tell them to oppose it, or to restore the amendment, the good faith religious defense amendment. So that website actually has call lists and has call scripts too. So you're welcome to use those or adjust them. So that's a resource created by another organization, but that we at ARPA Canada are promoting as well.
Now, if this bill passes as is, what would you say to pastors and teachers or parents to challenge them to openly speak about biblical truths?
Sure. Well, of course, we cannot but speak of the things that we've seen and heard. So Christians, of course, should not change the substance of what they believe, should not change the substance of what they teach publicly. Our calling, Pastor Stephen, is to faithfulness, to confess the truth clearly and without compromise. That doesn't mean necessarily speaking recklessly or carelessly. We're called to wisdom and clarity and love in how we speak. But when this pressure increases that we talk about, that temptation to become silent, to soften, to stay within approved boundaries, well, that's not a faithful response. We're called to continue speaking the truth carefully but courageously. And if I could add, Pastor Stephen, as a brief aside, as much as we're working as hard as we can to see this bill defeated, to see the religious defense stay, under God's providence, we win either way. Either the religious defense is restored and our civil authorities send a message to Canadians that religious defense is a core foundation of our nation, or Pastor Stephen will have an opportunity perhaps to suffer for Christ. And so we may look forward to that as well.
Oh, well, I just have one last question I wanted to pass by your table there, Paul, and are there any resources that you would recommend Christians to engage with in order to better prepare themselves as they engage with our Canadian culture?
Sure. So I encourage people to engage with ARPA's resources on Bill C-9, to visit Stop C-9 for practical ways to get involved. I mentioned that already. More broadly, I would encourage Christians, your listeners, Pastor Stephen, are probably already in this category of those who have a deeper understanding of Scripture and confessional
Right.
teaching and tradition in terms of the role of civil government. But I'd encourage, there's actually we're living in a great time of kind of retrieval and revival of interest in writing on matters of church and state. So, from different perspectives, we can look forward to, I think, an interesting study committee report from the PCA on Christian nationalism. James Baird has written a helpful recent book on church and state, King of Kings, I think it's called. In Canada, we have writer David Koizis, who writes, I think, yeah, thoughtfully and helpfully on some of these issues, all from different perspectives. But there's a kind of, there's maybe if I can use the R word, there's a mini revival in interest on matters of church and state. I think the COVID episode even caused a lot of people to go back and read Lex Rex. Even Lex Rex has been rediscovered in recent years. And so you'd encourage your listeners to pick that up as well.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you so much for your work, Paul, and for your time for our episode today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Confederation Report. This podcast is brought to you by the Cántaro Institute. Visit our website at cantaroinstitute.org for more information. For books to read on worldview, philosophy, and theology and how it interjects with culture and daily life, visit our store at cantaroinstitute.store. We'll meet again next time.